The Xalvians once stood at the height of galactic power, their advanced technology and mastery over energy manipulation, making them the envy of countless civilizations. Their ships were unmatched, their cities sprawling marvels of engineering. But it all came crashing down when they turned their innovations into weapons of war, causing untold destruction across several star systems. For centuries, they fought amongst themselves, tearing apart their own alliances and ultimately alienating the very species they had once considered allies. It was the Galactic Coalition, a collective of the galaxy's most powerful races, that decided the Xalvians must be exiled. Their past transgressions, the relentless wars, and the countless lives lost made them too dangerous to remain among the stars. A unanimous vote sealed their fate, and the once proud empire was sent to the outermost reaches of known space, to a barren and uninhabitable planet. The Xalvians had no choice but to accept their punishment, their entire race cast aside, and left to die in a cold, forgotten corner of the galaxy. On this desolate planet, the Xalvians fought not just the elements but their own dwindling hope. The planet's atmosphere was thin, with little in the way of resources to sustain them. The land was cracked. The seas dried up, and the skies were choked with dust storms that made survival a constant struggle. Their once thriving society was now reduced to a handful of survivors, scattered across the planet in makeshift settlements. The advanced technology that had once made them a powerful force was now nothing more than relics, unable to be repaired or properly utilized. With no way to communicate with the rest of the galaxy and no hope of ever rejoining the greater community, the Xalvians began to lose their sense of identity. In the ruins of a once great city, Kale, a young scientist, stared out at the vast, empty landscape. He had never known the glory days of the Xalvians. He was born during the exile. His parents had been historians, but even their stories of the old world felt like fairy tales to him now. Still, Kale clung to the belief that there had to be more than this endless cycle of survival. He had seen firsthand the toll the exile took on his people. Older Xalvians had grown bitter, their faces weathered by despair. Others, younger and filled with hope, struggled to adapt to the harsh conditions. Kale, however, refused to let himself succumb to hopelessness. He spent long hours in a makeshift laboratory, studying whatever fragments of Xalvian technology he could salvage. Most of it was broken, useless, yet there was a glimmer of something in the data logs he had uncovered. It was a theory, something his ancestors had believed could restore their fallen civilization. The Xalvians weren't meant to remain exiled forever. Deep within his heart, Kale knew that something had to change. The galaxy had abandoned them, but perhaps there was still a way out of this forsaken existence. Perhaps there was a force, an event, or even a new ally out there that could give the Xalvians a chance to rebuild. His thoughts were interrupted by a harsh, mechanical hum in the distance. He looked up, squinting against the planet's harsh sun. In the sky, a speck grew larger, coming into focus. A ship, no, a fleet of ships, was descending from the heavens. The Xalvians had been alone for so long that it seemed impossible. But as the ships drew closer, Cal's heart began to race. This was it, a sign that the galaxy had not forgotten them. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Xalvians had finally found their way back to the stars. The ships above the Xalvian planet were unlike anything Cal had ever seen before. They weren't the sleek, imposing warships of his ancestors, nor the crude salvage vessels that dotted the planet's surface. No, these ships were elegant, their design focused on function rather than intimidation. They had a distinct, sharp shape, unlike any Xalvian craft, and seemed almost organic in their smoothness. Cal's heart raced as he watched the ship circle, descending toward the planet's surface with precision. His mind raced with questions. Who could they be? What were they doing here? Could they be a threat, as so many others had been in the past? A voice from behind interrupted his thoughts. Kale, what are you looking at? It was Lyra, one of the younger survivors and a trusted ally of Cal's. She had been by his side since they were children, both of them raised in the shadow of their people's downfall. Cale turned, his voice trembling with excitement. I don't know, Lyra, but I think we're not alone anymore. Lyra's eyes widened as she followed his gaze to the sky. Do you think they're? Cale nodded, cutting her off. I don't know, but we have to find out. Without another word, the two of them hurried toward the landing site where the ships had begun to touch down. The desert sands kicked up beneath their feet as they ran, the wind howling around them. They were racing against time, not knowing if the visitors were friend or foe. The ships landed with a soft thud, the dust settling around them. The air grew tense as Cale and Lyra approached cautiously. Several figures emerged from the largest ship. They wore suits of dark, flexible material, their faces hidden behind helmets, but there was something about them that immediately felt different. There was no immediate sign of hostility in their stance. One of the figures removed their helmet, revealing the face of a woman. Her eyes were warm, but sharp, focused on the task at hand. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something human about her, a connection that Cale could almost feel despite the distance. She raised a hand, and Cale's heart skipped a beat. Don't be afraid, the woman said, her voice amplified through a device, but still carrying a sense of calm and assurance. We come in peace. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Cale wasn't sure if he could believe them. Peace. After everything that had happened, after centuries of isolation and abandonment, could this really be true? We are from Earth, the woman continued, her gaze meeting his. We've been tracking the energy signatures of your planet for some time. We weren't sure what we would find, but we knew we had to investigate. Cale's mind spun. Earth. He had heard the name before, in passing. Stories of a world far from their own. But to him, it had always seemed like a distant myth, a place his ancestors might have once known but had long since forgotten. The humans, however, seemed very real. And they seemed different from the other species he had encountered in the past, the ones who had cast his people aside. Why are you here? Lyra spoke up, her voice sharp, filled with both hope and suspicion. Why should we trust you? The human woman smiled softly, the lines around her eyes crinkling slightly. We're not here to harm you. In fact, we're here because we think we can help. Your people are in danger, aren't they? Cale could feel the weight of her words, but there was something in the woman's tone that made him believe she wasn't lying. There was an honesty there, something his people hadn't encountered in a long time. What do you mean? How do you know about us? The human woman's eyes darkened for a moment, and she exchanged a glance with her companions. We've been monitoring the galaxy. We saw your exile, and we believe you deserve more than what you've been given. You've been abandoned by the galaxy, but we don't believe that's the end of your story. Cale's heart swelled with hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Maybe, just maybe, the galaxy hadn't completely turned its back on the Solvians. Maybe there was a chance for them after all. I'm Captain Sarah Grant, she said, stepping forward with a confident smile. And I think we can help you rebuild what you lost. Cale didn't know what to say. The thought of trusting someone from the galaxy, especially humans, was terrifying. But there was also something deeply compelling about Captain Grant's words. Could this be the beginning of a new chapter for his people, or was this another illusion that would soon crumble? The answer, Cale realized, lay in the risk they were about to take. Cale stood in stunned silence, his mind racing. Captain Sarah Grant's words hung in the air, offering a fragile thread of hope that felt almost impossible to believe. The Xalvians had been isolated for so long that the idea of help from the galaxy seemed like a distant dream. Yet here was a human captain, standing on their dying world, offering something no one else had, a chance to rebuild. Rebuild. Lyra's voice cut through the silence. How can you help us? We've been abandoned for centuries. No one has cared. You're the first ones to come here in ages. Why should we believe you? Captain Grant met her gaze without flinching. Because we're not like the rest of the galaxy. We don't see your people as a threat. We see potential. We believe in second chances. Cale's heart pounded as he processed her words. The Xalvians had been exiled not because they were inherently bad, but because their history of war and destruction had painted them as dangerous. Yet this human, this stranger from another world, was offering them something they hadn't dared to hope for: redemption. He stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "What would you ask of us, Captain Grant?" She looked at him, her expression softening. "We don't ask for anything. All we want is to help. But it's not just about your survival. There are bigger things at play here. There's a force out there that sees your people as a threat, and if we don't act quickly, it could destroy not just you, but everything around you." Cale frowned, confused. "What do you mean? Who would want to destroy us now?" "The galaxy is a complicated place," Captain Grant explained, her tone serious. "And unfortunately, there are still many who see your people as dangerous. A warlord, a conqueror by the name of Zoreth, is one such individual. He has eyes on your planet, and he will not hesitate to erase you from existence if he sees you as a threat to his ambitions." The name sent a chill down Cal's spine. Zoreth was notorious, a figure whose brutality had been whispered about in hushed tones. He had destroyed countless civilizations, leaving them in ruins, and now the Xalvians were in his sights. "How do you know this?" Cale asked, his voice tense with urgency. "We've been monitoring him for some time," Captain Grant replied. "He's gearing up for an attack on your world, one that will make everything you've endured seem like nothing. We've already seen signs of his fleet moving toward this sector. If we don't act now, it will be too late." The weight of her words hit Cal like a physical blow. The Xalvian people, already on the brink of extinction, were now facing a new enemy, a conqueror who would show no mercy. His mind spun with the possibilities. Could humanity truly help them? Could they really stand against a warlord like Zoreth? Lyra spoke again, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. "What do you need from us?" "We need to work together," Captain Grant said, her eyes locked on Cale. "Your people have technology that could be the key to stopping Zoreth, but you've lost the knowledge of how to use it. We can help you reclaim that. We've got the resources, the knowledge, and the strength. But we need your cooperation. It's your people's choice: survive and rebuild, or be wiped out without ever having a chance." Cale felt a surge of emotion. The idea of cooperating with humans, who had once seemed so distant and foreign, was daunting. But the truth was undeniable. If they didn't take this chance, they would be nothing more than a footnote in history. They would never get another shot at redemption. "We'll help," Cale said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "We will work with you. We'll find a way to stop Zoreth." Lyra nodded, her expression softening. "We'll trust you, Captain Grant. For now. But know this: if we're going to fight together, we need to rebuild not just our technology, but our trust in one another." Captain Grant smiled, a look of relief crossing her face. "We'll earn that trust, Cale. I promise you. But we don't have much time. Zoreth's forces are already in motion. We need to act fast." Cale glanced back at the distant ruins of the Xalvian capital, a place that had once been the heart of their civilization. It was a symbol of their fall, their exile, their loss. But now, it could also be the symbol of their rebirth. If they could stand together with humanity, perhaps they could reclaim what was lost and forge a future where the Xalvian people would no longer be outcasts. He turned back to Captain Grant, determination burning in his eyes. "Let's start then. For the future of our people." The atmosphere was thick with tension as Cale stood beside Captain Grant, watching the horizon. In the distance, he could see the first signs of Zoreth's fleet, dozens of massive ships, their dark silhouettes cutting through the sky. The warlord was coming, and his forces were unlike anything the Xalvians had faced before. The weight of their desperate situation was undeniable, but Cale refused to let fear overwhelm him. This was their chance to stand up, to fight for a future they thought was lost forever. "Are you sure you're ready?" Captain Grant's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her gaze focused on the approaching fleet. "I don't think we have a choice," Kale replied, his voice steady. "If we don't stand now, we'll never get another chance." Grant gave him a firm nod. "Then let's make sure we make this count." The Xalvian and human forces had spent the last few days preparing for this moment. While Kale and his people were still learning how to adapt their technology to modern needs, the humans had been invaluable, sharing their expertise and showing the Xalvians how to use their ancient weapons in new ways. The air was crackling with the energy of determination as Kale stood on the command platform, watching the final touches being put on their defenses. "Ready, Cal." Lyra's voice cut through the noise. She had become an unexpected but invaluable ally in the war effort. Her knowledge of Xalvian history and technology had made her a key figure in coordinating the defensive measures. Kale nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're ready. Let's see if we can make a dent in this." Zorath's fleet was massive, and its firepower was overwhelming, but the humans and Xalvians had devised a strategy that might give them a fighting chance. While the Xalvian warships were not as advanced as they once were, their long-range weaponry was still formidable, and with the humans' guidance, they had integrated energy shielding technology and precision targeting systems that gave them an edge they hadn't had in years. "Activate shields," Captain Grant ordered through the comm system. "All ships, lock onto targets." Cal's eyes darted to the fleet approaching at breakneck speed. Their large, dark ships cast long shadows over the barren planet. Zorath's forces were here. He had no doubt about it. The ground shook as the first blasts from the enemy ships rang out, striking the planet's surface with explosive force. The battle had begun. The Xalvian fleet responded immediately, their weapons firing in perfect unison with the human ships. For a moment, Kel watched in awe as the coordinated attack struck the incoming enemy ships, their shields sparking and shattering under the force of the combined assault. The human strategy worked. Zorath's ships were being pushed back, but not without suffering damage of their own. Direct hit on the lead ship, one of the Xalvian officers reported, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. But the celebration was short-lived. A massive warship in the rear of Zorath's fleet fired a barrage of missiles, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. One of the human ships exploded in a burst of fire, and several Xalvian ships were knocked off course, their engines flickering out. The Alliance's forces had made progress, but Zorath was relentless. "Stay focused," Captain Grant barked into the comm system. "We can't afford to lose momentum. Push forward." Kel's stomach tightened as the battle raged on, the air filled with the sound of weapons fire and the cries of the wounded. He had never imagined he would be here, fighting alongside humans, for a chance at survival. The Xalvian people had always been alone, and now they were fighting not only for their lives, but for the chance to reclaim their place in the galaxy. "We've got incoming," Lyra shouted from the control station. "They've deployed ground forces. They're coming for the city." Kel's blood ran cold. Zorath had always favored ground combat, and it seemed he wasn't content to simply destroy their fleet. The real battle was about to begin on the surface. "Prepare for ground combat," Kale ordered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Deploy all defensive units. We'll make our stand here." The human and Xalvian forces scrambled, moving to set up defensive lines around their makeshift headquarters. Kale had no experience with hand-to-hand combat, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was it, their first real test. If they couldn't hold the ground, if they couldn't stop Zorath's forces here, everything they had worked for would be in vain. As the ground shook from the impact of enemy forces landing, Kal's mind raced. He had to believe this would work. He had to believe in the humans, in his people, and in the chance they had been given. The battle was far from over, but this was only the beginning of their fight. "Let's show them what we're made of," Kale muttered under his breath, rallying his troops. The fate of his people hung in the balance, and for the first time in a long time, Kale felt the spark of hope burn brightly within him. The ground trembled as enemy forces landed in massive waves. Zorath's war machines advanced, heavy armored units crushing the dry soil beneath them as they moved closer to the heart of the Xalvian settlement. The battlefield was a chaotic blur, blasts of energy, the screech of metal on metal, and the distant screams of soldiers caught in a crossfire filled the air. Cale stood at the front lines, his heart racing in his chest. The Xalvian forces, bolstered by the humans' advanced tactics, had done their best to hold back the oncoming tide. But Zoreth's ground forces were relentless. The defensive lines, once thought to be impenetrable, were slowly being pushed back. "We can't hold much longer," Lyra shouted, her voice tinged with panic as she fired a burst of energy from a makeshift cannon. "They're too strong. We need backup now." Cale gritted his teeth. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to save himself and his people. But he couldn't. Not when they had come this far. Not when they were this close to having a chance to rebuild. "Stay with me," Cale shouted, rallying those around him. "We've faced worse before. We can do this." Just as the situation seemed to spiral out of control, a crackling sound echoed through the battlefield. It came from the sky, a deep rumble that didn't belong to Zoreth's forces. The distant hum grew louder, and before anyone could react, a sudden flash of bright light illuminated the horizon. A fleet, but it wasn't Zoreth's. "Look," Lyra shouted, pointing toward the heavens. "Another ship. There are more of them." Cale's eyes widened as the first of the ships descended rapidly, their hulls sleek and shining against the darkened sky. It wasn't just one ship, but an entire fleet. The humans had called for reinforcements, and now they were arriving. The ships, which had been positioned for defense, began to open fire. Their energy blasts, bright and sharp, lit up the battlefield like a beacon of hope. "Now, attack." Captain Grant's voice boomed through the comms. "Target Zoreth's ground forces. Take them out." The new ship swooped down, firing concentrated beams that tore through the enemy's ground forces with precision. Xalvian and human forces alike took heart, seeing the new ships join the battle. The momentum began to shift. "We've got them on the run," Lyra exclaimed, her voice cracking with relief. "They're retreating." Cale could hardly believe what he was seeing. Zoreth's forces, who had been so sure of their victory, were now faltering. The ground forces that had been closing in on the city started to scatter, some attempting to regroup, others simply fleeing the battlefield in panic. "We can win this," Cale whispered to himself, the weight of his own disbelief sinking in. His people, after all they had suffered, might actually pull through. However, his thoughts were interrupted as a massive explosion erupted nearby. A blast of energy struck one of the human ships, sending it spiraling downward in a shower of sparks. It crashed into the desert floor with a deafening roar, the remains of the ship sending up a plume of smoke and debris. "Captain Grant," Cale shouted, his heart sinking as the wreckage burned in the distance. "We're still in this fight." Captain Grant's voice came through the comms, strong and steady despite the danger. "Focus on the enemy, not the losses. We're winning, Cale. Keep your people fighting." Cale took a deep breath, rallying his forces once more. The tide had shifted, but the battle was far from over. Zoreth was no fool. He wouldn't retreat easily. If anything, this was the moment he would unleash his final assault. "We need to finish this now," Cale muttered, gripping his weapon tighter. "If we give him a chance to regroup, we'll lose everything." With renewed determination, Cale joined the front lines once again. The humans, though suffering casualties, had given the Xalvians a fighting chance to survive, to reclaim their home. They couldn't waste it. As the enemy ground forces scrambled in disarray, Cale and Lyra led a charge, pushing forward with everything they had. The humans and Xalvians worked together like a well-oiled machine, their combined forces too strong for Zoreth's troops to withstand. Each energy blast fired, each soldier that fell, was a small victory in a much larger battle. The final push came when Captain Grant's fleet sent in its most devastating weapon, an energy pulse that could disable enemy machinery for miles. Zorath's remaining forces, caught off guard and unable to defend themselves, were decimated in moments. Battlefield, once filled with the roar of battle, fell silent. It wasn't over yet. Zorath was still out there, still a threat. But the Salvians had won their first battle in what felt like a lifetime. The chance to rebuild, to reclaim their place among the stars, was within reach. They had fought for it, and for the first time in centuries, Cale felt something he hadn't dared to feel before: hope. The battlefield was eerily quiet after the final pulse from Captain Grant's fleet. The once overwhelming roar of combat had been replaced by the crackle of burning debris and the distant sounds of soldiers moving cautiously through the aftermath. The forces of Zorath had been dealt a serious blow, but Cale knew this was not the end of the war. It was merely a pause, a moment of respite before the real battle began. Cale stood with Lyra, watching as the Salvian and human forces began to regroup. The sky, once darkened by the smoke of battle, now held the promise of a new dawn. The first rays of light broke through the dust clouds, casting an amber glow over the scene. The city, though damaged, still stood, a symbol of resilience, a reminder that they were not finished yet. "We did it," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with awe. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, her face weary but determined. "We actually did it." Cale nodded, his thoughts focused on the larger picture. "We've won this battle, but Zorath is still up there. He won't just give up." Lyra's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the remains of Zorath's fleet floated in the sky like dark vultures. There were fewer ships now, but the presence of Zorath's warlord was unmistakable. Cale knew that the warlord would retreat, regroup, and strike again, and the thought made his stomach churn. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to return," Cale continued, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to go on the offensive. Now that we have a fighting chance, we have to push him back before he can recover." Lyra agreed, her expression hardening with resolve. "I'll get the commanders together. We can't waste any time. If we're going to stand a chance, we need to plan our next move carefully." As Lyra moved off to organize the strategy meeting, Cale turned his attention to the surviving humans who had fought beside them. Captain Grant was talking with her officers, her face a mask of determination, despite the exhaustion that was evident in her posture. "Captain," Cale called as he approached her. She turned, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Cale, I thought you were with your people." "I was," he said, his voice firm. "But we need to talk about what comes next. We've pushed back Zorath for now, but we can't afford to sit idle. If we wait too long, he'll come back stronger." Captain Grant looked at him for a long moment, her eyes calculating. "You're right. We bought some time, but not much. I've already sent a message to our command. Reinforcements are on the way, but it'll take time to get here. Until then, we need to strike while we can." "Strike," Cale repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" "We need to hit Zorath's supply lines," Captain Grant explained. "If we can take out his logistics, we cripple his ability to wage war. We don't need to destroy his entire fleet. We need to target the things that keep his machines running: fuel, weapons, ammunition. Without those, he'll have no choice but to retreat." Cal's eyes widened. It was a risky plan, but it could work. "You're saying we go after his supply ships?" "Exactly," Captain Grant confirmed. "If we hit them quickly and efficiently, Zorath won't have time to react. We hit him hard and fast, then disappear into the shadows before he knows what happened." Cale felt a surge of adrenaline at the thought. This was their chance to cripple Zorath's war effort for good. But it wasn't a mission for the faint of heart. They would have to move fast, take risks, and trust each other completely. "I'll organize a strike force," Cale said, his mind already racing with tactics. "We'll need stealth, precision, and speed. We can't afford to waste any time. Let's take the fight to him." Captain Grant gave him a determined smile. "That's the spirit I like to see. I'll coordinate with my fleet. We'll be ready when you are." As they parted ways to prepare for the next phase of their strategy, Kale felt a flicker of hope ignite deep inside him. The Ixalvians had fought alone for so long, isolated and forgotten. Now, they were no longer alone. Humanity had shown them what it meant to fight for something greater than survival. And together, they might just have a chance to win. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm light over the battlefield, and Kale made his way to his forces. The war was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn in their favor. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, to take back what had been lost. As Kale gathered his troops, the Salvian people stood with him, no longer just survivors, but fighters. And they were ready to take the fight to Zoreth, to finish what had been started and reclaim their future. The night before the strike, Kale couldn't sleep. His mind raced with possibilities and strategies, each one more dangerous than the last. The plan to target Zoreth's supply lines was bold, too bold, some might say. But it was their best chance. They had no time to waste. If they didn't act now, they could lose everything they had gained. The room around him was silent, save for the distant hum of machinery. Lyra had already gone over the final details of the mission with him, and the strike team was ready. But Kel couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something crucial that he hadn't accounted for. He stood up from the makeshift table in his quarters and walked to the window. Outside, the planet's twin moons bathed the land in a soft, silver glow. The battle had taken its toll, but the city still stood. For now. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Kale turned, and there stood Captain Grant, her face as determined as ever. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Kale gave her a tired smile. "Too much to think about. We're about to take a huge risk. If we fail." "We won't fail," she cut him off, her voice unwavering. "I know the odds, but I also know this. Together, we've already done the impossible. We can do it again." Kale met her gaze, finding comfort in the confidence she exuded. He had never expected to find such a strong ally in the humans. They had been strangers when they first met, but now, after everything they had been through, they were comrades, partners in a war for survival. "You're right," Kale said, his voice steady. "We've already beaten the odds. Let's finish what we started." Grant gave him a small nod. "The fleet's in position. We move at first light. Get some rest, Kale. You'll need it." "I'll try," Kale said, but he knew sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. As the night passed into morning, the team assembled in the central command center. The mood was tense but focused. Everyone knew the stakes. They had a small window of opportunity to strike at Zoreth's supply lines, a chance to weaken the warlord's grip on the galaxy. The plan was simple: hit hard, hit fast, and get out before Zoreth could retaliate. Kel's team was made up of both Salvian and human soldiers, each with a critical role to play. Some would infiltrate Zoreth's supply depots and plant explosives, while others would provide cover from a distance. They had only one shot to make it work. If they were detected or too slow, they'd be facing Zoreth's full wrath. As they prepared for departure, Kale gathered his team. His heart pounded with anticipation, but there was no room for fear. They had no choice but to succeed. "Remember, we moved together. We hit the depots hard and fast. In and out, no mistakes," Kale said, addressing his team. "Stay alert, stay focused, and trust each other. We have one chance at this." Lyra, who had become an integral part of the team, stepped forward. "The enemy is expecting a direct assault, but we're going to hit them from the shadows. We'll have to be quick to avoid detection." Captain Grant gave a firm nod. "We've got the best technology and the best soldiers at our side. Let's make this count." The plan was set. The team moved out under the cover of dawn, the quiet hum of the transports masking the urgency of their mission. As they neared the target zone, Kale could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for. If they could destroy Zoreth's supply lines, It could turn the tide of the war in their favor. The transport ship touched down in a hidden valley near the supply depot. The area was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Kel's team disembarked, weapons in hand, ready for whatever lay ahead. Lyra motioned for silence, and the team fell into formation, moving through the dense foliage toward the depot. It was a massive complex, surrounded by high-tech security systems and heavily guarded. But Kel had confidence in his people. Together, they were unstoppable. The plan had them infiltrate through a series of underground tunnels, bypassing the most heavily fortified sections. Their first objective: plant explosives on the primary fuel storage units. If they succeeded, Zoreth's fleet would be grounded, unable to replenish its resources. It would cripple his war effort. Kel's heart raced as they neared the depot. They were in position. The countdown had begun. Time was running out, and failure was not an option. As the team split up to execute their tasks, Kel could only hope that they had prepared enough, that their training and trust in each other would be enough to see them through. The underground tunnels beneath the supply depot were narrow, cold, and silent. Kel's breath echoed softly in the passage as he moved cautiously, his boots making little sound on the concrete floor. His team was spread out, each member on their designated task, but he could feel the tension thickening in the air. The plan had to work. There was no room for mistakes. Lyra was the first to signal the all-clear. She and her team had reached the main fuel storage area, the heart of Zoreth's supply chain. Kel could see her outline in the dim light of the tunnel, her silhouette against the glow of her handheld device, as she started placing the explosives. "We're in position." Lyra's voice came through the comms, steady but tense. "All we need is a signal to trigger the charge." Kel checked his watch. They had exactly 5 minutes before Zoreth's patrols would make their rounds, and it was a narrow window. The depot was well guarded, and the slightest noise would alert the enemy. Every second counted. Kel's heart was pounding in his chest, but he couldn't afford to let his nerves show. He moved toward his part of the mission, targeting the communication towers that linked the depot to Zoreth's fleet. Disabling them would not only stop the flow of critical information, but also isolate the depot from the rest of the warlord's forces. A communication tower loomed ahead, a sleek metal structure that stood tall against the starry sky. It was heavily guarded, but Kel had prepared for this. He gave the signal to his team, and within seconds, 2 human soldiers moved in from the side, silently taking out the guards with swift precision. The quiet thud of their bodies hitting the ground was the only sound, the faintest ripple in the night's stillness. "Clear," one of the soldiers whispered into his comm, their voice barely audible. "Tower's ours." Kel nodded. He quickly moved in and set the explosive charges on the base of the tower, making sure they were set for maximum damage. The tower would come down in a matter of minutes, but it would be worth it. Zoreth would lose control over the depot. He had no idea how close they were to victory, how much closer they were to finally ending his reign. The comms crackled again. "Kel, we're ready here." "Everything's set," Lyra reported. "It's time." "Wait for my signal," Kel responded, his voice calm despite the growing tension. He took a deep breath, and then keyed in the trigger to detonate the charges on the fuel storage. He had to time it perfectly, and the slightest mistake would cost them everything. His fingers hovered over the device for a brief moment before he pressed the button. The ground shook beneath his feet, a deep rumble that echoed through the tunnels. A series of explosions rang out in rapid succession as the fuel storage detonated, sending a massive fireball into the sky above the depot. The shockwave rattled the ground, and Kel could feel the heat of the explosion even from underground. The depot was on fire. Zoreth's entire supply chain was in chaos. Lyra's voice came through the comms, exhilarated but focused. "It's done. They're scrambling. We have a small window before they realize what happened." "Time to go," Kel said, his voice sharp as he gave the order. "Everyone move out. We've done what we came here to do. Now let's get out before Zoreth can retaliate." The team moved quickly, retracing their steps through the tunnels. The alarms began blaring overhead, the first sign that the enemy was waking up to the destruction. But Cale knew they had no time to waste. The underground passageways were their only escape route, and the enemy would likely be flooding the area with reinforcements soon. As they reached the exit, Cale could see the light of dawn breaking on the horizon. The first streaks of sunlight illuminated the smoke rising from the burning depot. The mission had been a success. They had dealt a significant blow to Zoreth's forces. But just as they were about to climb into their transport ship, a familiar voice crackled over the comms, sending a chill down Cale's spine. "Cale, this is Zoreth." The warlord's voice hissed through the static, cold and venomous. "You think this changes anything? This is only the beginning. You'll regret this. You're nothing but insects, and I will crush you all." Cale clenched his fists, his anger rising. Zoreth had just declared his intent to retaliate, but Cale wasn't afraid. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "We'll see who gets crushed," Cale said through gritted teeth. "This war is over for you, Zoreth, and you'll be the one regretting it." As the transport lifted off, soaring into the skies, Cale allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had struck at the heart of Zoreth's empire, and they had done it together, humans and Salvians, united in a cause greater than any of them had ever dreamed. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Cale allowed himself to believe that victory was within reach. The fight wasn't over yet, but they had finally taken the first step toward freedom.